Hi, Phil Long, Precision Agronomy Advisor with Latham High-Tech Seeds. We're out here on another beautiful day in our premier agronomy center and talking today about ear flex and corn hybrids. So this is something that a lot of times gets overlooked, but it's a very important piece of the puzzle, not only when we're determining populations, but also, as I'm going to talk about today, on the management side and understanding how you can manage our hybrids better for higher yields. So we want to back up and at least talk a little bit about where this came from. This study here, you see a few ears on the board today, but this is actually a very large study, about an acre in size, and 2 locations throughout Latham country. And we're planting at 2 different populations. So 24,000 and 36,000 gives us that full flex in a particular hybrid. So hybrids typically flex differently depending on the season. But they always flex the same way. So genetically, and we'll talk about that here in a second, they're going to flex in the same ways no matter what circumstances they're in. So where did this come from? I used to have the stress wheel out here as a big wheel of corn that was kind of cool to look at. It went from 15,000 population to 60,000 population. It was neat to see the ear flex and how big a drastic change it was, but maybe wasn't as practical. So I set up this study. This is something that we can plant using, modern planters, precision planting and so forth. Pretty simple to create this study. Do several hybrids at one time and then go out and sample the ears and understand where that flex is coming from in a hybrid. So, ear flex, what does it mean? When we're talking about ear flex in corn, and our Latham product guide is going to show you what ear flex it has, whether it's a full flex, a semi-flex, and we have some that say M, which are kind of right down the middle. And then we have semi-determinate and determinate. There's not a lot on the edges. We do have a couple in each category, but not a lot on the extreme edges of full flex or full determinate ears. Most of them are in the middle, given modern breeding techniques and just the environments they're planted under nowadays. So how do they flex? Typically in 3 ways. So I've got a couple examples here, but the 3 ways are girth around, row number. So where your yield comes from is the row numbers around. And then flex in length, so kernels long, and then lastly they're going to flex in kernel depth. So sometimes you may see 12 rows around or 14 or 18 or whatever it is, but that flex in kernel depth may mean you may fit your hand around it at maybe a higher population like this one at 36, but at a lower pop or less stressful conditions, it's going to flex much bigger, and I probably wouldn't be able to get my hand around it. So those are the 3 ways that corn flexes. And I also want to mention that it flexes down. We always like to talk about how it flexes up. It's easier to think about flexing down because when you put that kernel in the ground, it starts at a certain yield potential and then works its way down given the stress and the conditions in your environment. So that's what these 2 populations show you. You're going to have a lower population for less stressful environment, more sunlight into the canopy, more room for those roots to grab more nutrients and water and things like that. So that represents maybe a less stressful environment and things like this. You also look at the plant type as well in our book. So things like more flat leaves instead of upright or semi-upright leaves. Those things all go together to help determine a population. But the other side of this is not only can we better understand what population to plant these hybrids at, but we can also understand how to manage them better. So if a particular hybrid, I'm going to start over here with this one. This is our 5377 Double Pro. This is a great example of a semi-determinate type of ear. So what does that mean? Typically semi-determinates determine the ear more up front. So up front in the season, meaning so from basically emergence to V5, V7, that's when it determines those rows around. A lot of times, the semi-determinate is going to put on a similar number of rows around no matter what the population is. So you might as well push the population a little bit in a semi-determinate because you're always going to put on those number of rows around. And then it can flex some in length given the conditions, but a lot of times in the semi-determinate, you're going to see most of that determined up front. So on the management side, what do you need to do? Well, number one, semi-determinates, you don't want to stress them up front. You want to make sure that they're coming out of the ground fast. Maybe don't plant this one the earliest on your farm because it's going to be really keying in on that early season time period to develop this ear and determine your yield potential. So having nitrogen there when it needs it, having the other nutrients there, typically a hybrid that flexes more up front, semi-determinate girth-wise, early in the season is going to take more advantage of an in-furrow starter, or just in-furrow, or 2x2 or 2x2x2 starter, so that you can grab those nutrients early. It feels good early in the season, puts on lots of rows around, and then the stress of the rest of the season may determine how long the year is, but at least you've got those rows around set really well. On the flip side of this, a semi-flex hybrid like our 5245, one of our most popular hybrids here, 102-day semi-flex, you can see this one loves to flex in length. So length is determined a little later in the season. We talk typically about girth from emergence to V5, V6, and then we have that period from about V6 to tassel or R1, where it's determining how many rows long that ear is going to be. And then after tassel and pollination, it may potentially abort. So up till grain fill, about R4 or so, it's going to determine how much tip back and so forth ends up on that ear. And that's another good indication when you're looking in your cornfields, determining population, how well you did. You can see that in both of these situations, there's not much tip back. So there's a little abortion at the top of this higher population here, but here it filled out to the tip. So obviously, it could use more population here. You're losing out on yield because you could have stacked maybe another ear in there in between those plants and got more yield because it filled out as much as it could. When you get a little bit of tip back, that's not a bad thing. Within an inch or so, if you're seeing more than an inch, then probably you had stressful conditions or something happened to really shorten that ear up a little bit. But in terms of a semi-flex, some of the management techniques that you can use to better manage a semi-flex is going to be mid to late season. So those that have opportunities to put on things like mid-season nitrogen or foliars and fungicides. Once we get to the last part of the season, that V4 to V6, R4 to R6 time period. So we're in that grain fill time period up to black layer, essentially when it's finishing the ear out. That still has 30% of the yield left to put on the ear, and that is going to be in the depth of the kernels. So remember, if you have a hybrid that flexes later in the season, can potentially put on a lot of kernel depth, it's going to take advantage of that fungicide. So if you've ever been in the situation where you put on a fungicide and didn't see a response, you might have been planting something that determined a lot of the yield up front. So if you're planting a hybrid that flexes better towards the end of the season, it's going to take a hold of that plant health aspect a little bit better, even if you don't have diseases out in the field, and put on that additional kernel weight and kernel depth and provide that extra yield bump that you typically see with a fungicide. So 5-10% or better. So those are the two different styles of ear types that we have, and the importance of this and what I'm doing here at Latham's, obviously, this is going to be done at a little higher level in the coming years, but developing more of a high management guide. So to sum things up on our hybrid stress test, we talked about the 4 different types of ear types that we have, and we talked about how the different management things that you can do to get better yield out of these. This is something that we'll be continuing on in the future for several years as new hybrids come on. So we're looking forward to getting a lot of good information on how we can better manage our hybrids in season to get that higher yield.